Hey guys, when you search for Bible-related stuff, virtually all the results are from Christian pastors and apologists.
Yeah, to find real biblical criticism, you need to dig down. Most people never even learn about all the scholarship out there, which debunks a lot of the evangelical claims.
Yeah, there's an entire well-funded industry of biased Christian content out there.
Our show tries to offer a counter-argument to them, but we rely on our listeners to keep the show going week after week. If you'd like to support the show, please check out our Patreon at www.patreon.com/Skeptics Bible Project.
Thank you to all those supporting us. We hope you enjoy the show. I'm John.
And I'm Ben,
And this is the Skeptics Bible Project. We read the Bible
so you don't have to.
I don't care too much for preachers. I don't like to go to church. But I'd hate to meet St. Peter when my body leaves this earth.
Hey everyone, please enjoy John and my continuing conversation and reaction to Wesley Huff's appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience.
Yeah, I mean, all of this stuff is endlessly fascinating, but definitely not the stuff that Wes is talking about.
Yeah, we went off on a tangent, an interesting tangent, but a tangent nonetheless.
And again, we're not trying to be overly critical. We did actually like this part of what Wes said about the analogy that we think the gospel author is making between Jonah and Jesus. That is the interesting stuff that you see at a textual level.
Let me just say this, back to what I liked about what Wes said, is that I'd always obviously known that the gospel authors are making the analogy to resurrection to Jonah and the way that Jonah was in the belly of the fish. But what I never really thought about is how even like the author of Jonah perhaps thought of it as death and resurrection. And that was kind of an interesting thing to think about.
It's something that, again, the way that Christians read the Gospels now, you would never pick up on something like that sort of subtlety. The other thing that I thought was interesting is rabbinic tradition is such a catch-all term that's used by Christians, because rabbinic tradition, like, you can almost find anything in rabbinic tradition, because it's just rabbis arguing back and forth over like the minutia of every. So it's a way to maybe gauge like, okay, this is like the debates that were going on during this time, or this is like the things that this particular author is putting in the mouth of these various rabbis in these like dialogues, or. But the way that it's structured is you have like divergent perspectives. So it's like not like it's like authoritative in the way that he's making it seem authoritative. But again, overall, I want to be gracious. I actually thought this part was relatively interesting also.
Disorder of Sheol, which is the realm of the dead.
Is that where they disposed of bodies?
In the ocean?
Yeah.
No.
No?
No.
Vikings did, right? Didn't they like light boats on fire and push them out there?
Yeah.
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 But it wasn't a common practice amongst other civilizations.
Not that I know of. I mean, Jews would definitely, really ancient Jewish conventions of burial, you would just bury someone in the earth. And then by the time you get to Jesus' day, you had like family tombs and stuff.
Well, there was an ancient hominid that's not human, and one of the things that they were so fascinated about was that they buried their dead. And that they did so in a cave. Do you remember that, Jamie? Do you remember who was discussing that?
This should be interesting, because now early hominids is not something that I think Wes even believed in.
It's just like I do want to be kind of hypercritical, because this whole thing is just so ridiculous. First of all, there's no connection with Viking practices. That's just like a weird analogy to even make, except it in some like abstract way, because the civilizations are totally apart. Again, he's sort of looking at it as like, oh, it's like all these things on a cosmic level are the same, or they're tapping into some like alien life that was known on many continents. Like, Joe Rogan is an idiot.
Yeah, but it's also funny that Joe Rogan is not at all going down any of the pathway that Wes is trying. Every time Wes says something, he's like, yeah, yeah, yeah. Aren't the Vikings like, it has nothing to do with where Wes Huff is trying to go with this.
And then so Wes is like, no, they would follow conventions. So again, this is what I would do if I was on the show. I would be like, well, remember we were just talking about, I mean, I wouldn't have talked probably about Jonah, but while we're talking about Sheol, the whole way that concept developed was because people were buried underground. It was somewhere
Right.
deep in the earth, in the belly of the earth where the bodies resided.
Yeah.
And that's why it's like, you knew me in the pit of the earth before the formation of my body. That's the true pro-life position, because God, before he knitted them together in their mother's womb, he knew them even in the foundation of the earth. And that's not a really ancient Hebrew perspective. That comes from contacting the Greek world. I think the idea of Sheol was basically just the place of the dead, the earliest idea, and the idea that we think of as like a place where the spirits are is a much later idea. And I think that comes from contact with other cultures, and also, again, from the Greek sort of totalizing of the world that happens like under Alexander the Great.
It was, they did not think that this version of ancient primate was capable of these things. And then they seemed to have confirmation through these very extensive cave systems that there was at least one area where they would put their dead.
Yeah.
And it was a difficult path to get to this, too. This is a very small hominid, and I think people have tried to make their way through it, and it's really hard. Like, some of these caves, you're, like, basically crawling on your stomach, which is fucking terrifying.
I'll pull it up. Dentaletti chamber.
So they've founded this ancient hominid, which, didn't really look like us.
Yeah.
Was burying their dead.
Yeah, I mean, burial conventions change over time. The ways that they're burying in the ancient Israelite days are very different in the conventions than when you get to Jesus.
Karen, as archaeologists uncover evidence of intentional burial cave engravings by early human ancestor. What did that sucker look like? So the Denaldi chamber, what is the type of Homo naledi, right? Homo naledi. Google that, see what they look like. Homo naledi. What we think they look like, right? Whoa, that's crazy.
This is hilarious.
So as a Christian, what do you think about all this stuff? Like, what do you think about ancient hominids, Australopithecus, Neanderthals? Like, what was God up to with all this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a scientist, so I got to stay in my lane. I ultimately would be an advocate for intelligent design, where I would say that that God purposefully created humanity in a way. You had Stephen Meyer on, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so, I mean, he's one of those guys who talks about...
I'm actually really interested to hear where this goes, but there's a lot of comedy happening for me here. Because first, Wes Huff tried to completely sidestep the early hominid stuff. And Joe Rogan's like, no, I'm going to stay on it. I'm going to look up what they looked like. And Wes Huff doesn't want to go. The first thing he says is, I'm not a scientist. Then he says, I'm an intelligent design advocate, which basically says that God created such and such. Well, first of all, that's hilarious, because intelligent design's entire thing is that we're not saying it's God. We're just saying we see some form of intelligence in this creative order, which we all know that intelligent design is actually just a repackaged creationism, trying to get creationism taught in schools. And they know that's clearly a religious notion. So they say, well, it's intelligent design. It's not a religious notion at all. We're not talking about a God necessarily. It's just some sort of intelligence. Could be aliens. We don't know. But here, Wes is like intelligent design, then immediately says it's God, which I just think is funny. Because so if you're saying God, don't say intelligent design, just say creationism. And from what I heard Wes say earlier in some of our previous episodes, he's more than likely a young Earth creationist. So he doesn't believe in the hominids at all. The idea that there was precursors to man through evolution. I'm guessing, I don't know for sure. So, I'm sorry, Wes, if I'm getting you wrong here, but it seems to me like he denies Darwinian evolution, common descent, etc. So I'm interested to see where he goes with this, but I just think those things are kind of amusing.
Yeah, it's basically just an abstraction because we can see evolution in certain things in a short span of life. It's undeniable. I wish Joe Rogan would really press him on the hominids. What does he mean intelligent design? Was this just a species that was designed that went extinct? Because he would probably have to say, no, this was just a deformed human or something.
Right.
And he would say, oh, the dating is actually wrong. And it's push them on these abstractions, but the specific examples, because that's where I think their apologetic arguments really fall apart. They always wanted to say intelligent design. Well, what do you mean intelligent design? The way that we see evolution happening when they're reconstructing it theoretically backwards, people online will say mutation is never useful, which again is like not just, that's an abstract concept. The whole idea is you get a random mutation that for certain happenstance becomes more optimal for survival. And then that becomes a dominant trait over time because those traits are more likely to survive as they're passed on. And that could be because a meteor hits the Earth and the only things that can breathe are microscopic organisms. At some point in time, that's what it was, or tiny little rodents or whatever. So a lot of it is so purely contingent on what is useful at any given moment. And we're talking about how old is this hominid that he's talking about? Are we talking about 4 million years ago?
I don't know the answer to that. Might get to be maybe 1 million years ago, but I don't know enough about it. I just think it's hilarious that, there's a lot of history with this entire intelligent design movement, right? This has been going on for years. And the big thing is they constantly say, no, 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 we're not talking about religion. That's the whole reason they say intelligent design, because they want this to be a scientific endeavor that they can put into the schools. But Wes Huff immediately completely undercuts that. And it feeds right into what people like us have been saying all along to say, wait a second, no, this is just religion. And he immediately says, yeah, intelligent design because God did it. I'm like, so why don't you just say you're a creationist that believes in a literal young earth Genesis? Now he's literally just saying intelligent design because it sounds a little bit less like Christian Orthodox to use the words intelligent design. It couches it in a more scientific sounding language, even though it's just a repackaged creationism. But I've already said all this.
Yeah, and I mean, we're old enough to remember doing all of this in the 90s and the early 2000s when the intelligent design stuff was first popularized. And they were trying to, when the Texas schools were trying to put it into schools. And Stephen Meyer is not a scientist. He's a journalist. So he's just writing what he's getting from these various people that he's collecting there. He's trying to piece together some specific narrative.
We could do a whole episode on intelligent design, but the bottom line for me, it's all God of the gaps, because it basically comes down to, science has a hard time explaining X, Y, and Z, therefore God did it, And to me, that's a fundamental flaw in the reasoning of most Christians on this topic.
It's a deeper topic because they bring up the philosophy of science and all these rabbit holes about epistemology, but it's basically when you have something like this that they're confronted by, unless they're going to attack the evidence and say, well, this isn't really real, but I wish he would really press Wes to say, how does this fit with your biblical timeline? We went through all these things in the 90s and the early 2000s, and actually the position of science, I feel like, won out in the public sphere. Right. Now there's like this return of the repressed.
I'm not sure it's going to win out anymore, though.
Now it's come back in this viral form where people are just totally regressive about scientific knowledge, and they say the most asinine thing, like the videos where they show evolution happening over millions of years that get ridiculed because they're like, you're saying that I came from a fish, and it's like, oh my God, like, no, that's not what it's saying. But anyway, it's a longer topic, but I just think We won the culture war on these issues at one point in time, and it's unfortunate that we have to like continue to fight these same stupid talking points that are just like rehashed.
We can't progress any further because we have to keep going back and winning the same battle over and over again, because these people constantly trying to bring us back into the dark ages, where we can't trust the scientists and academia is suspect. Anyway, let's continue on. I am genuinely curious to see
about kind of the issues that he sees with evolution. And I think I have some of those issues too. My friend Jonathan McClatchy is a biologist, and he does some really great presentations on the ways that he sees kind of the intricacies of Neo-Darwinian evolution is not quite explaining some of what's going on with things like the fossil record and some of the gaps that we have in there. When you talk about early hominids, I mean, ultimately, I think that there are aspects of the fact that there are ancient cultures, which, I mean, humanity obviously looks very different today than it did, if we're going tens of thousands of years ago.
Right.
And so I think that there's a different kind of convention in understanding. But ultimately, I would ascribe to there being an original Adam and Eve, and that those are like, if you want to call them like our first parents kind of thing. But there are other Christians who I would disagree with, but I think have interesting articulations of that in terms of theistic evolution. I disagree with them, but it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility to find explanations. I don't think the Bible is trying to explain how people came into existence in the same way that maybe we want it to. And a lot of people read the origin stories in Genesis as a scientific textbook. And I think ultimately that misses the point of what Genesis is trying to say. This goes back to what we were talking about with like, how did the original audience understood this?
Right.
When they read Genesis chapter 1, are they looking at that as an exact prescription of what God did? I mean, in some ways, maybe, but in other ways, they could see that as this like counter-apologetic to the other ancient Near Eastern stories, like I explained. So I just think we need to be careful when we're looking at, or even like counting up the genealogies and coming up with how old the earth is. I think that might be missing the forest for the trees in what we're actually looking at when we look at ancient documents and how we're trying to interpret them.
Let me just try to address a little bit. I think it's interesting that he just has no desire whatsoever to defend his actual opinion, because the only thing he gives you on his actual opinion, he says Adam and Eve are the first human beings, and we descend from them. And then there are people that disagree with that, but he's like, I disagree with those people, but that's okay, kind of thing. But he really wasn't willing to actually go in. And this is what I find with a lot of Christian young earth creationists. It's frustrating. They're not really willing to engage on it. I'm like, if you have an opinion about it, he's very opinionated about a lot of things, and he's willing to give you his reasoning. But on this, he doesn't. He's just like, well, I disagree with those people, but there's other Christians that think such and such, and the Bible's not really laying it out. We don't know what the original audience said. He's just really ambiguous with it. And that's frustrating because he holds the view of young earth creationism. I wanted to hear him defend it, but he didn't go there.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. It was he was intentionally exploiting ambiguity, even the way he was couching his language. As soon as he stated his position, he pivoted to, but there are other people that have other things to believe. He basically did a bunch of fallacies in a row. If you really want to get down to it, he relied on Jonathan McClatchy as his expert. And he's a biologist. He says that there are gaps, so he did the God of the Gaps, that we can't explain in conventional evolution, so he thinks that maybe creationism could be true. And then he basically said, bottom line, it comes down to, I think there was an original Adam. But other people think, like, theistic evolution is possible. And people look different, even now. That's how I explain the hominids. Did Joe Rogan say these were small?
Yeah.
could barely fit in caves.
Yeah, I forgot to say that was also really funny to me because he's like, well, human beings look very different now than they did 10,000 years ago. I'm like,
I mean, if you
that's
go
not
to
really
Colonial
true.
Williamsburg, doors are a little bit shorter
Right.
because now we're getting the good nutrients. Maybe they didn't have good nutrients at that point.
Yeah, so let's make it clear what he's saying there. He's saying that the hominids that Joe Rogan are talking about may have just been small human beings. That's what he's talking about.
Descended from Adam,
Right,
who
they're
was the
descended from Adam.
original human.
Right, and keep in mind, we're talking about hominid. We don't know because we'd have to look it up. Probably a million years ago. It does not fit at all with anything that Wes Huff is talking about. If you look at the anatomical structure, these are not humans. They very clearly not human beings. Their skeletons are not anything that any Christian would say that was a human being. Now, if you do say they are human beings in some sense, that's more aligning with the evolutionary standpoint. That's why we see these similarities.
Yeah, I mean, you always have the problem of the gaps for this stuff are way bigger than what the Bible's describing. So Wes addressed that ambiguity by just saying, we shouldn't be expected to take Genesis literally when it's calculating generation to figure out how old the earth is. That would be silly. But if you come down to it, I do stand with historical Adam as the first person, which is also ridiculous.
Yeah, historical Adam and Eve, that's one of the more, I'm trying not to say that's one of the most ridiculous things to believe. I'm trying not to say that. And I'm just saying it's one of the more difficult things as a Christian to hold to with what we now know about science. You're taking this, in my view, pretty clearly mythological tale about Adam and Eve, and you're saying historically that actually happened. And then he's completely unwilling to defend it. And really, the way he defends it is to say, well, some Christians don't believe that. He's like, well, the way I'm going to defend this is to tell you that there's some more progressive Christians out there that don't hold to this. Basically saying, even if my position is insane, you can still be a Christian. His core philosophy is don't throw out Christianity. You should become a Christian. Don't let this be the thing that throws you off. Instead of actually having a good, interesting discussion, which is what Joe Rogan is trying to do about the hominids and evolution and how that fits within Christianity.
He sort of made an apology at the beginning. He starts off saying, listen, we shouldn't think that Genesis is trying to literally tell us scientifically how the world began. Right? That's not what the authors are doing. That would be like misreading the text. And then he says, but basically, like everything Genesis says is true. What are you saying, Wes? Is it true or is it not true? We can take that literally or not literally. They always leave this ambiguity open. And then they say, there's a lot of different Christian perspectives. This is the major issue that Christianity has. It's so malleable that you can never nail it down. Everywhere you try to touch it, they just move to a different position. And people say this about evangelicals. There's just a million traditions. You can always rely on a different church father that believed a different thing or some other strand of Christianity that existed at some period of time. There's no one Christianity.
On the scientific side of things, you have basic evolutionary biology that says common descent is real. All life on Earth stems from the same original life form, and you defend it. But it's a big target for Christians because that's the one thing that science has. It's just one clearly taught scientific concept. Whereas in Christianity, you're right, it's impossible to try to criticize it because they're like, well, I'm a Catholic, so I don't really view it that way. And there's just a million different offshoots and perspectives. And then even within, when someone actually believes something like Wes Huff on young Earth creationism, you can't even nail him down on it because he's just sidestepped and says, well, you don't have to hold this view. No, I want you to defend that view. That's the thing I'm interested in hearing about. Because you spent the first part of the interview talking about the truth of Noah's flood. That was a big part of what he's talking about. No, Gilgamesh is not a problem. There really was a global flood, blah, blah, blah. And then when you pin him down on evidence, about the hominids, it's like, well, I don't know. A lot of people have different views on that. Yeah, if what Joe Rogan is saying is true, it also completely crushes your flood mythology also.
Yeah. The way that I would tell the story of the Bible would be the way that various traditions developed into the text that we have today. Genesis itself, but the first 11 chapters of Genesis are a whole different level of the ancient histories, like the flood myth and like the Tower of Babel. There's almost no way to take that as historical. The names of all the people would just like happen to perfectly coincide with their literary roles in the story. The names of all the places, like Babel, obviously is like a shot at Babylon. Even the snake means cunning. The word for snake means cunning because that's what he is in the story. Wes could have pivoted. Again, this is what I would have done. I would say, yes, clearly we know hominids were alive. Burying practices for Jews would have consisted of putting people on the ground. Were the earliest practices, because that's just almost universal practice for humans, because bodies rot if you just leave them out. Our earliest texts that we have describing human behavior, they were putting bodies under the ground or in caves or whatever. And then he does talk a little bit about caves cut at biblical times, what he should have just started talking about. But again, there's different stories in Genesis. So even pretending that, I hold to the Genesis narrative, Adam and Eve, well, that's different than the Genesis 1 narrative where God creates humans last, not like humans first of all the animals, and then creates all the other animals to bring to Adam as helpmates, and they all are not adequate, and then he creates Eve from Adam. It's just two different stories. One, he makes humans from the ground. The other, he's pulling everything up from the ocean on various days. On the other, he makes everything in like one day. So Wes is trying to have his cake and eat it too. He's saying, we shouldn't take these texts super wooden and literally, but then he's also saying, but I do hold to these texts. So he's pleasing his apologetic base who's like, good job, you preached the gospel. You held firm that that's the truth. But he's also being so ambiguous as to like say like, but we should also be open to reading this in a literal way because people like Augustine thought it was literal. So it's fine. Like you've said abundantly. He should just say what he actually thinks. How old are these hominids? Do you think these hominids are like the ancestors of humans or the cousins of the ancestors of humans or however they're related to human beings? How do you think life developed?
The other thing that kind of pisses me off is he'll be like, well, I'm not an expert on that. I'm not a scientist, but then completely discounts all the people that actually are biologists and experts. And he'll bring up the one so-called biologist who is like a wackadoodle that most other biologists and scientists around the world would say, this guy's a crackpot. He's just saying total pseudoscience and inputting religious ideas into science where it doesn't belong. Joe Rogan, if he's interested in this question about the hominid, he could have on an actual expert, world-renowned scientist. I'm sure they'd be thrilled to come on the show. Instead, he has Wes Huff there that will say, I'm not a scientist, I don't know what I'm talking about, but just say, I believe in young Earth creationism, I believe Adam and Eve are real. And that's super frustrating because he's obviously curious about these things, and there are people that are trained to answer these questions. They've dedicated their lives to it. They have written peer-reviewed journals and scientific literature, et cetera. And they could refute anything that Wes Huff would say about this. But we don't have those people on. We're stuck here with this moron talking about Adam and Eve being literal. And he also does this bob and weave thing, which is really frustrating. When it's something that he has infographics that he's made about, he can go on and on about it because he's thought about this is what's going to persuade you to be a Christian. And when it's something that he really doesn't know how to answer, he just completely sidesteps and says, well, there's Christians that believe this and Christians that believe that, and that's okay. And I'm like, well, that's not really doing the job because ultimately what you see with Wes Huff, he's not interested in the actual facts, the actual data even the interesting thing that Joe Rogan is interested in, he doesn't really care. He doesn't care about getting to the bottom of that. All he cares about is you becoming a Christian. That's why the way he answers it is just, well, Christians believe different things on that, and that's okay. I'm like, yeah, but that's not what we're talking about. We're trying to have an interesting conversation about the hominids here. and and you just completely sidestepped it because all you care about is, does this affect your apologetic narrative?
Yeah, he sidestepped the Genesis literal question. He sidestepped the hominid question. I thought that before too. The whole thing about this is so frustrating because Joe Rogan could have said, "Oh, I just read this story about these hominids that buried bodies." He could literally have the scientist on,
Right.
that person that discovered this, or the one that wrote the paper about it. In a day, he could probably have that person on because they'd be like, "That's the chance of a lifetime to come talk to Joe Rogan." And then instead of him just thinking about something crazy off the top of his head, he could ask that person questions who's actually an expert about that specific topic. That's what a normal journalist would do. But this is just, I just want to hear this guy riffing on a bunch of different stuff. It's not a good way to process information.
And think how insulting it would be to the author of that article, that paper, to hear Wes Huff on the biggest show in the world discussing it, saying like, well, people looked really different 10,000 years ago. Maybe it was just a group of really short people that were in caves.
You've read Lord of the Rings, right? So you know there's hobbits.
It's just so absurd. And it's insulting to anyone with a mind, frankly. Anyone that wants to actually get to the bottom of what really happened in the past, actual science and history. It's insulting that this guy is on the biggest show in the world talking about it.
I'm not making arguments for atheism per se. I'm just trying to make people think about things that are the reality that they may not think about normally.
Same.
If you think about human history the way science has mapped it out, and they have good evidence for this, human history, the agricultural revolution, we started just planting instead of hunter-gathering, and these are we're talking about huge chunks of time, tens of thousands of years back in the past. When you're talking about the beginning of evolution, we're talking about such a huge expanse of time earlier. But in the Christian mind, all of that is gone, and everything starts 6,000 years ago. So how do you even make sense of that?
That's what I think what annoys me is it's such a radical departure from what all of science for over the last several hundred years has told us about the reality of science and history. And they believe something so out of line with that, but then try to present it as it's totally reasonable to say the things I'm saying. No, you can believe it. I don't have a problem if you believe it. I have a problem of you trying to tell me that's a reasonable thing for other people to believe. If you want to believe that there's ghosts living in your attic, fine. But to me, that's not reasonable to think it's actually true. I don't think other people should believe. And I'm not going to nod my head along with you like, yeah, that makes sense. That's normal. No, it's not normal. It's not okay. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's frustrating. And part of the whole frustration is that Wes Huff is being treated as an expert in anything. But for him to be asking him questions about these hominids, he doesn't know anything about this. So even the Hebrew Bible, I feel like Wes Huff has already gone way over his head.
Yeah, we've talked about that.
And it's like, just chill, dude. Stick with the document.
If you're going to bring on Wes Huff for anything, bring him on about apologetics. Because that's what he knows about. He knows about how to try to persuade people, how to put infographics together. That's what he's actually doing.
There's this compulsion amongst pastors to think that they know about everything. And I would just consider Wes Huff a pastor that I have that same compulsion. But the difference is I'm not necessarily preaching out of my pretty specific purview of knowledge.
But you're also not claiming to be some kind of expert.
Definitely not telling people how to live,
Right.
aside from to help the poor, what to do for good politics.
I think the big difference, if anyone is out there saying, well, you guys aren't experts either, that's absolutely true. And we're being upfront with that. That's the difference. We're saying we're not experts. We're critiquing the logic of what they're saying as just people interested in it.
And 7.5 million people have viewed this Joe Rogan, Wes Huff interview. So not even close to that many people are going to hear our podcast.
I don't know. We're coming up. But
if we get to 7 million, I'll be happy with that.
Again, my biggest frustration with apologetics and pastors in general, I don't mind it if they say, look, I'm in a church and I'm preaching a sermon. I have a lot less reason to criticize that, even though we have, if you've listened to our show. What I really have a problem with is when they couch it as if they themselves are in this academic arena as historians or scientists. That really gets me, because I'm like, you're really taking away the credit from the people that actually are experts in this, and you're giving what I would call morons a soapbox to stand on and an audience to hear. They haven't earned that. And now you have Wes Huff. They're treating him like we should pay attention to this guy. We should listen to him. If you had him on and said, like, this is Wes Huff, he's basically a pastor, I would be less critical of it. But they're not doing that. We could go back and listen to how Joe Rogan, at this point, people are like, oh, no, please don't go back. You're like 17 episodes into this. But at the beginning, Joe Rogan couched him as he's like this phenomenal, expert on history and the Bible. And that's right there, the big pet peeve I have with this entire.
It's all in the framing, because people are listening to this like, wow, this Wes Huff guy really knows about not only the Bible, but also about hominoid burial practices. He's real smart about everything. And it's like, come on, oh my God.
Joe Rogan is basically not turning into, I think he's already there, Coast to Coast, that show. He would love it if he could have someone on the show that Joe Rogan could say is an expert, that is telling him that, yeah, aliens built the pyramids, and he would love that. And that's really the endeavor of the show, because that's what people want to hear. There was a great clip that you showed me, Ben. Who was it talking about the Joe Rogan show?
Oh, yeah, I don't remember.
It was like Logan Paul or something.
It could be.
I think it was Logan Paul. I'm confused because I don't even know who those people are. There's Logan Paul and he has a brother. I don't know.
Yeah, they're like from the UFC world.
But they were like, the gist of it was, he was like, Joe Rogan told me the worst interview he ever had on his show. And he was like, okay, what was it? And it was like,
oh, yeah.
This old Egyptologist guy.
I got so mad at that guy. He was dying of cancer, and because he corrected a bunch of like his like fucking mythical stupid shit.
He was like, yeah, he was on the Joe Rogan show, and he was just some old Egyptologist guy, supposedly knowing all about Egypt. And Joe Rogan kept trying to get him, is it possible that there was aliens? And the Egyptian guy was just like, no way, that's ridiculous. And it's like, that was the worst interview Joe Rogan ever had. It's like, yeah, what do you know? You had an actual expert on, and he was like, all that is pseudoscience bullshit that you shouldn't even listen to. And yeah, it's not sexy. It's not going to bring in huge ratings, but it's just true. Actual human beings built the pyramid. Hominids are real. Magic is not real. I'm sorry that doesn't draw the attention of your viewers, but if you're actually interested in the truth of what's happening, you should have on the experts. By the way, that Egyptologist, the world-renowned, I forgot his name, he's great. You should listen to him. I'm sorry, it might not be interesting to you that he's telling you the aliens aren't real, but it's way more interesting to me because I'm trying to find out what actually happened in the past.
If there are actual gaps in evolutionary theory or ambiguities, then I would be interested to hear that too, and how that works. But I don't think that the logical conclusion of that is God exists, because that would be like a fallacy in itself. This was going to happen at some point. that Wes was going to say, yeah, I'm basically a young earth creationist. Now, he didn't say those exact words, but he basically said,
He believes in a literal flood. He believes in a literal Adam and Eve. I think it's pretty clear. And he called himself an intelligent design.
he's like, we shouldn't take the time frames literally. So maybe he believes in like a 6-day creation. We have to do an episode on this, I guess.
I mean, he's right. There are many different views of the Genesis creation story and how it can be interpreted by Christians. But in my opinion, it's just a giant endeavor to make it make sense in a modern sense, because when you read it, it seems impossible to actually believe this. So they're forced to go back and reinterpret. It's the same thing they do with predictions about the second coming. When Jesus says that he'll be coming back in the lifetime of his followers, he must have been talking about this abstract generational concept that no one got at the time. But it's all their way of getting around difficulties in the Bible. Why not just say, yeah, they were teaching this thing about a 6-day creation, and we now know that that's impossible. Or they were teaching that there was a dome over the earth, and we now know that there isn't. But they can't say that because they're committed to saying the Bible is true in every single way. Wes Huff sounds like an inerrantist. Like, he believes the literal truth of every word in the Bible and that there are no errors in it. I bet if he came out and actually said it in those terms, Joe Rogan would be like, oh, well, that's crazy, because what about the errors that we find in it? But what bothers me is this bob and weave he does to try to not really say the thing that a lot of people are going to listen to and say, oh, well, that's crazy. He has to get around that. So you see what I'm getting at?
So there's so many huge problem. The biggest problem is that Wes is not taking a stand here. He's trying to have it both ways. And it would be nice for him to lay out exactly how he thinks all this works. Was it just a literal 6-day creation? Was it like 6 billion years ago that happened? Did it happen 6,000 years ago or whatever it is? There was a flood that destroyed the whole earth, or was it a local flood? Was everyone's language confused at Babel? And then explain the scientific data that we have. Well, what about dinosaurs? We know those fossils are old. Well, okay. He's not even treating the text as text, which is just to say, what we really know is these texts are developing in, the 8th century and the 5th century BCE. There's scribes that are accumulating different traditions together. They probably go back further. They follow the motifs of the ancient Babylonian creation myths, only they throw in the twist of the god Yahweh, the watery chaos. He's not even really engaging with the text itself. That's the other thing that's frustrating to me. You're supposed to be a textual scholar. Somebody posted this meme on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. I call it Twitter. Some people call it X.
I like Twitter better. I'm just going to call it Twitter.
Yeah, I just call it Twitter but they had this meme where it was these boxes of all these people that were sort of ideological enemies, sitting next to each other on a plane, and there's the middle seat is open, and you had to choose the seat that you would take, and one of them was Wes Huff and Bart Ehrman.
Right.
And somebody said, oh, I would sit between Wes Huff and Bart Ehrman and have them discuss textual criticism. But the reality is that would be a one-way discussion.
What bothers me about that analogy is that you're putting Wes Huff as kind of an intellectual equal to Bart Ehrman, and they're just not.
Yeah.
Not even close.
Yeah.
There are people, you could put N.T. Wright next to Bart Ehrman.
Paula Fredrickson.
I'm not saying that there aren't Christians that, are on the level of Bart Ehrman. There certainly are. But this guy is a cheap apologist masquerading around as some kind of academic, and he's obviously convinced a lot of people because they're saying things like that. It's not fair to Bart Ehrman because of, the status he's attained and the amount of schooling and stuff he's learned. Have they ever had a conversation? I feel like Bart Ehrman would just destroy him because Wes Huff would just not have any idea how to answer at the depth that Bart would be able to go into.
Wes Huff did a review of either misquoting Jesus or I think it was misquoting Jesus or Jesus Interrupted. It was one of the two of them. It's on YouTube. After we get through this marathon, we should someday do a review of that because that would be fun. Listen, Bart Ehrman is a world-respected scholar. When magazines like National Geographic is going to publish an article, they'll have him oversee talking to different scholars. I mean, he teaches at one of the most prestigious universities. He has a degree from one of the most prestigious universities. Everyone should just have some respect. But to think that Wes Huff is even close to that level is laughable. Or to think that it would even be a fair fight. When it comes to textual criticism, Bart Ehrman is one of the foremost experts in the world.
Right.
In that very specific thing. Bruce Metzger, who again, like, this is like what everybody always says about Bart Ehrman, which is kind of like insulting that everybody still has to say this because evangelicals all love Bruce Metzger. Everybody knows Bruce Metzger.
Right.
Universally just hailed as the best. And Ehrman was basically like his
understudy.
He was helping him do his basic work day to day.
They wrote a book together, and to hear Bart Ehrman tell it, they don't even really disagree on much. There's not that much separation between someone like, honestly, like Bruce Metzger were alive. Joe Rogan should have him on the show. I'd be fine with that. I wouldn't be arguing. We'd have a much better conversation. It wouldn't be as much of me and you being annoyed at the situation because we'd be like, okay, at least this is the person that when he talks about the information that he has, I would totally trust that it's reliable if Bruce Metzger was talking about it. Anyway, we've, I think, hammered this idea home a lot.
The framing has just been the real problem. And we just keep coming back to that. But the way that Wes was portrayed and also his inability to pivot towards anything that he does know about, and then his ambiguity in answering crucial mistakes on Wes's part.
Right.
The Skeptics Bible Project is a John and Ben production, with intro music by John Lobker. Support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Skeptics Bible Project, and follow us on all social media platforms at Skeptics Project. Got questions or comments? Email us at skepticsbibleproject@gmail.com.